Welcome to the next tutorial. So in this one we're going to cover really basic cameras and lighting. I just want you to be able to essentially at this point set a light in the scene and understand some of the base settings that you need to adjust so you have enough enough understanding to be dangerous. Right? We're not going to go into any of the really in-depth stuff until a later tutorial, but I just want you to be able to actually light your scene to render it and to be able to to play with those settings and figure out what they do. And so we're just going to go over the base stuff, really like how to set light color. Maybe we'll talk about a couple of different types of lights, but you can really experiment with those. And then how to turn on shadows. And really that's it. And then we're also going to look at cameras and how to set up cameras and how to jump from one camera to another. So we're going to start with cameras and then we'll move to lights. So this scene I made from all the models we made in the previous tutorials. I played with like the bend deformer on the tower. I've used a couple arrays. I used the atom array on the squid, and that was interesting. And so I just threw things together. Oh, the cup that we just made is in here somewhere too. There it is. I have no idea where that should go or what that should do, but we'll just set it off over here and maybe we'll make a couple of copies. I don't know. Oops, that was the wrong button, but whatever. Yeah, so you can see, right, the X-wings are arrayed and they're sticking out. You don't have to copy what I'm doing here with your scenes, right? You could be putting landscapes in or whatever you want to do, really. But I'm just going to throw some things around here. You know, maybe I'll make up a narrative at some point about what this is. But there's cups. Maybe the cups are just there to create some sense of depth. So right now I have these all kind of set, but what I don't have is a camera set to frame the view that I want to take a shot of. So right now we are operating in the default camera, right? And so every time I'm moving all of this, moving my view around, what I'm actually doing is I am moving a camera around the scene. And so, but it doesn't have like any boundary. It doesn't, you don't see it and you can't adjust any of the settings on the default camera. It is just the default camera. But to create a new camera or an additional camera, we just can go to this camera object and click on it. If I click hold, there's a few different options. We're not going to talk about any of those right now. But if you're interested in doing like 3D video and stuff like that, or 3D images, you can totally use a 3D camera to do that. But we're not going to do that right now. We're just going to create a new camera. And when I do that, this camera will show up in my hierarchy. And what happens is whatever you have framed, wherever your default camera is in the scene, when you create the camera, that's the initial view that the new camera will have. And once this new camera has that view, I believe when I go and rotate, okay, cool. So I'm going to rotate my view. You'll see that it says default camera up here, right? If I scroll out, now I can see this camera body and this big green pyramid, right? And that pyramid is essentially saying these are all the things that will be included within this frame, right? This is the frame that when I render will be rendered. And so to switch back and forth from the default camera to the view of this other camera, you go up to your object hierarchy and there's this little gray box here. Then when you hover over it, it says camera object. If I click on that little gray box, it'll zoom me into this new camera and you'll notice that it says camera up here now instead of default camera, right? And if I rename this camera, if I call this, you know, my awesome camera, and then I jump back into it, right? Now it says it's my awesome camera, right? So you can have as many cameras as you want, right? If you are shooting like a complex animated scene where you want to be able to shoot from several different viewpoints that you can jump between, right? So you're rendering out 3 angles of the same shot, then you could have 3 cameras or 4 cameras. Or also, right, sometimes what I'm going to ask you to do in projects is to have one, like, you know, is to shoot 2 views of your project. And so you would create 2 cameras and shoot those 2 views. Now, one issue is that it's really easy to forget that you are in your current camera, and then you go to move around to see something and you're like, oh crap, I just messed up my view. There's a way to fix that, but we'll talk about that, to lock a camera, but we'll talk about that in a future tutorial. I just want to show you how to create one. Cameras do have lots of settings, and you can play with some of these things, but we're not going to really go into any of the details on this. The only thing you might be interested in using right now is under the composition tab. You can click on any of these things and it puts this overlay on your view that either does, right, this is the rule of thirds, which is a compositional, one of the rules of composition, right, is that if you can either center things in your frame, or, right, if I actually move this camera around a little bit, right, if I set things so that they are in these places, then it can make the scene more dramatic, right? And so if I have, this at the bottom third, and maybe I actually select one of these cups, oh, this one is actually the one that I wanted, great, right? I can pull this around so that, this is centered here, and maybe these other cups we end up moving somewhere else, right? But these are some tools that can allow you, that can help you to frame things in your scene. And so that would be the one thing I would say under the camera to use. If you want to turn that off, you could either uncheck enable or just uncheck the one option you have set. Right? There's also diagonals, right? That's often like motion, or objects aligned along a diagonal across the frame creates a sense of motion. They have this golden section, which is like rule of thirds, but a little different. And then they have a crosshair that just shows you basically where the center of the screen is. And triangles, if I turn off grid, right, it just, again, it's more like two diagonals. And then there's the golden spiral, which you can also use as a way to frame shots. So I'm going to leave that on in this camera. And then, so I'm going to go ahead and, right, pop out of this camera if I want. I could just leave it here. But let's go ahead and say I'm really happy with this, right? This is the best thing I've ever done. The best composition of all time. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it here. Now, to see what your view looks like with lights on and rendered, all you do is you hit, to render into the viewport, you hit Command or Control R. And you'll see that with all these objects, it takes a little bit of time for my computer to render that scene, but not too long. And this is just with what's called the default light, right? The default light, kind of like the default camera, there's no settings you can adjust on it, and it's just there so that you can actually see objects in the scene while you're modeling. And then when you render it, you can see them, because that you can see objects in the scene when you render it. Okay, so how do we create lights and position them and do all of those things? So let's go ahead and create a light. Now, the light object, surprisingly enough, looks like a light bulb. There are all sorts of other lights in here. The PRB light will not work in this scene because it's a really special light. But sunlight, infinite light, there's a few different types. This is like a point source light that radiates lights in all directions. Infinite light is sort of like actual sunlight outside, where the light source is so far away from us that it essentially is like a wall of light coming towards us that hits everything at the same angle. If you want hard, crisp shadows in your scene, infinite light or a point source light that's a really long distance away from your scene is the way to get those shadows, right? The closer, when you use like well-rendered shadows, the closer the light source is to an object, the more diffuse the light is, the shadow is behind it, right? And the further a light source is away, as long as it's bright, the harder and more crisp those edges are, right? And that's physics. And what the lights do and what rendering does is essentially all 3D software, all the rendering is to create this simulation of the real world using the laws of physics to do it. And sometimes breaking the laws of physics to make things a little easier to model and look better aesthetically. So one of those things that can break the law of physics is lights. So I'm going to go ahead and create one light. And you'll see that already everything changes, right? The default light has been turned off. And the only light source in the scene is inside here. Now you will notice that this light is essentially penetrating the models and lighting other objects in the scene, but there's no light in this front view. So before I do anything else, I'm just going to pull this light up out of this model so I can see things. So now if I have this one light, before we do anything else, I just want to show you, right, here are the light attributes, and there are a lot. I mean, look at all these tabs. There's tons of things you can do with these lights to make them look special, to change the way the lighting in the scene looks. If I go ahead and hit Command R right now, or Control R in Windows, you can kind of see what the change already has happened. Now, something to note, you may think, oh, the shadows are on because there are areas of darkness. Those are just areas where light is not touching, right? But it is not showing anything where, like, say, a shadow is being cast from one object onto another, right? They all self-shadow in that the geometry of the object itself creates a shadow on the other side, right? So the light doesn't pass through the object, but it doesn't create a shadow anywhere else. So one of the first things I always do, unless I'm using a light, unless this light is just to fill in some detail and I don't want to create any additional shadows to do that, I go ahead and put on shadow maps. So there's three different, or shadows, there's three different types. There's shadow maps soft. This renders pretty quickly. Ray traced hard. This always gives you hard shadows, but they're pixelated, but it renders real fast. And then there's area shadows. Areas are the most physically accurate. It takes a little bit longer to render. I'm going to go ahead and do area because they look best. And I'm going to go ahead and render this again. And you'll see it takes a little bit longer, but you'll also see now I'm starting to get this like feathered edge here on the shadow. And you can see that more things are being hidden by the light in the scene. So let's look at a couple other settings, and really we're only going to go into the general tab today. We're not going to deal with any of the other tabs. Those are for later tutorials. So the next big thing is the light color, right? There is very little, if any, truly white light in the universe, right? It's things get really close to being full white, but every light has a bit of color to it, right? It's either got, and usually that is measured when it's outdoor lighting and indoor lighting now. You might see as you're going, if you go shopping for like new LED lights, they tell you how many degrees Kelvin they are, or they tell you if it's a cool or a warm light. And when you, if you're thinking in that way, if you go down here to this use temperature button and check mark this, what happens is you get this value here called color temperature. And color temperature is measured in degrees Kelvin. 6,500 degrees is, it's basically it's the most even lighting, right? The higher the degrees, the cooler the light is. The lower the degrees, the warmer the light is, right? So if I go, and if you search for, if you just search for color temperature graph on the internet, you'll get a lot of these things, but there's a few of these that are a little bit easier to understand, right? So this one, I just want something simple. So here we go, right? So blue sky is 7,500 degrees Kelvin. Direct sunlight is 5,500. Sunrise, sunset is 3,200. A 40-watt light bulb is 2,500. Candlelight is 1,500. And then like 0 is infrared light, right? And so, you know, there's all sorts of different things, and they kind of tell you what these, you know, daylight is somewhere between 55 and 6,500. And then, you know, we're in kind of the sunset range there, right? So if I click back on whichever one this one was, let's look at what sunrise, sunset looks like, direct sun and blue sky. And then we could try like a bulb. So let's go ahead and cool this down, or warm this up to 30, oops, I'm going the wrong direction, to 3,200 degrees. Right. And so all this does, you may notice the color, that's close enough. You may notice the color up here changing, and right, so all this does is it's an algorithm that takes this value here and converts it into a hue, saturation, and vibrance value. Right, and so I render that, and that is like sunrise, sunset, warmth of lighting, right, on gray material. If I hop up to somewhere around 6,500 degrees, this is much cooler looking, and this would be like true bright full sun, right? And with one light and the way it's set up, it doesn't quite look accurate. Also, it's being rendered on this gray material. And that's something we should talk about. When you start working with lighting, obviously, if you have all your materials kind of dialed in, that's great, but it's really good to start working with some color on your objects. So let's go ahead and go to our standard layout if you're in model layout like I was. And just, I don't need either of these materials here because we're just going to go ahead and create a new one. But so just go ahead and double click to create a new material. Now this material is white. Notice that the vibrance is set to 80%. And that's because no object in the world that I know of is absolutely like has 100% white vibrance. It's very rare. And it's sort of like trying to find something that's truly black, right? There are a couple paints out there now called like Vanta Black, and there's some other one that is like, that absorbs like 99.9% of light. And those have only come out in the last few years. And if you have something that's absolutely black, there's just no detail, right? It just, like if you had a sphere and you painted it black with one of these things, it would look like a flat disc of black, right? And similarly with white, like everything, all detail would disappear if something was like truly reflecting 100% of the light that was hitting it. So let's go ahead and we can start applying this material. Now, it would be a pain in the butt to try and apply it to all of these objects in here. And so what you can do is you can also click and drag, and you can drop it on objects in the hierarchy, right? And so I can say, okay, well, I want my whole atom array to be white. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can see that that change took place. I'm going to come on over here. I'm going to drop this on the X-wing, so all of those turn. I'm going to come back up, and I've got, where's my tower? If I drop it on the tower, it should color all the towers. And then I'm going to go ahead and color some cups, right? I wish I had made an array of these cups because this is a lot more work, but that's okay. We can just get that done quick, right? And so having some sort of just simple white color is good. If you know that you, oops, I think that's all I need. Let's go ahead and render this again. Right, and so this, this is with the white color on these objects, and it begins to make things a little bit more accurate. It looks like there's at least one cup that's still gray, but that's fine. If you know that you have an object that's going to have like some reflectance that's going to be shiny, you can double click and create another material and double click on that to open the material editor. And then it usually defaults you to starting on the color channel. You can click on reflectance and you can just go ahead and click add. And these are all super shiny reflective materials. And then this, you really, if you have this on an object, it's a perfect mirror, and with all the darkness in the space around us, you're not going to see a whole lot. So you can, if you take this layer where it says normal here, this is layer 1, this is the one I just created, and I drop this, you know, reflectance down to like 26%, and then let's just apply this to the towers. So I'm going to select the material that's already on there, this tag, I'm going to delete it. I'm going to go ahead and just replace it with this. And you'd think you'd put it here, but it gives you the no symbol. You have to actually drop it on the name of the object. Right? Okay. And so now these are shiny. Now you see all this reflection of like trees and stuff in here. That's just the way that it tells you that it's reflective in the editor. Right? If I render this now, right, I'm going to get these like bright highlights on the surfaces. They look glossy. But I'm not getting any, right, I'm not seeing any scenery because there's no scenery. The only thing I might see in this reflection would be the cups or the other objects. Okay, so we've got one light, right? One light doesn't usually do it. And this light is actually like the most boring color ever. So let's go ahead and either make it more blue or more warm. Let's make the color temperature of this light, you know, really red. Right? So you can see how, even though these are all white objects, the color of the light in Cinema4D can make a huge difference on what this scene looks like. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and, now that I'm done with the boring, I'm going to leave it this light a little bit cool. And I'm going to start by, I'm going to go ahead and create a second light. Now, there's a couple ways I could do that. I could either recreate it from scratch, or if I want this light to have some of the same properties, I can select the light in my hierarchy and hit Command or Control C and Command or Control V to paste it. And now I have two lights on top of each other, right? Which is doubling the light intensity coming from that same point. You may have noticed the scene got a lot brighter when that happened. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to move this light, and I actually want to move this light so that it's illuminating some of the fronts of these cups. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my view from my awesome camera to the default camera, because then I can see where this is in relation to the camera, and I can actually pull this light over here, and maybe I want some shadows. I don't want it to be totally blasted out, and maybe I want this light to be lower, like below my scene, right? And what's nice is now I can rotate this view. Oh, that's still above my scene. It's just way out in the middle of nowhere. Right, so maybe I want this light to be down a little bit. Having light come from different angles and different places in your scene can make a big difference on how it looks. And the other thing is mixing the colors of light can make a big difference too. So if I have this light, one light that's a little cool, and I make this other light just on the other side of middle ground, so it's, you know, it's still there, but it's definitely warmer. When I jump back to my awesome camera and go to render this, right, those two different types of light mixing together make for a much more visually dynamic scene, right? And so now I've got these two different lights. I've got something that's much more dramatic here. And I still have like all of this empty space, right? I'm imagining this is a space station, and I could maybe put a star field in there or something like that, right? But that's not what's happening now. You can imagine this being maybe a sun that's lighting the space station, and then the blue light is from like the ambient light and the stars and other objects reflecting that sun's light onto the surface of this space station of squid and towers and X-wing noses. So this is the basic primer on lighting. You can play with the different types of lights if you want to. You can always, instead of use temperature, you could always go in and make lights whatever color you want them to be. If you want green, great. The one thing I would say when you're working with lighting is the saturation does not need to be very high to have a big impact in the color of the light. So, right, if I was to make this much greener, you know, it's going to be, right, really vibrantly green. And so that's something to just be aware of, is that, you know, really you just want to be a little off-white when you're, you know, very little saturation when you're working with this. But, you know, we could do magenta, whatever color of lighting you think would look good in your scene. That's a possibility. Okay. So let's go ahead and save this, and that will be this tutorial.